duet, you two. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Good morning, everyone. Well, this guest speaker has been a long time on the schedule in our queue, so I'm really excited to have her here today. So we welcome Catherine Rourke, who is the Siuslaw News columnist, and she will share with us the importance of celebrating our fathers. Catherine is an editor and journalist who picked up a quill pen at age 4 and has been writing ever since. Educated at the City University of New York, University of Oxford, yes, and the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. She began her career at the Miami Herald in 1978, training under several distinguished mentors, recently featured in the movies Spotlight and Kill the Messenger. Catherine worked for over 30 years as an investigative reporter at newspapers around the country, specializing in social justice and medical issues. In 2007, she launched her own nonprofit newspaper to publish her previously censored Truth in Medicine reports, earning a Journalist of the Year honorarium, plus 24 additional press awards. The former New Yorker now specializes in memoir as a book editor for Amazon and a creative writing instructor at the Florence Regional Arts Alliance. She is currently writing a memoir about her media experiences titled, "And Forgive Us Our Press Passes." Confessions of a Modern-Day Muckraker. And now, Catherine Rourke.
Well, she finally got me up here. Rick's been trying to get me to come up here and talk for 3 years. Congratulations. Good morning and happy Father's Day to everyone. Father's Day comes in many flavors. Maybe you don't have kids as we think of kids. Maybe you've got a dog or a cat. Maybe you've led a Boy Scout troop or you've coached a sports team. Maybe you're a mentor in some way to a youth. So for all of you, think of ways in which you've been a father. And today we're going to celebrate that. And we're also going to celebrate our fathers, those who have gone. Maybe some of you are lucky like Betty, you still have your dads with us. And we're going to take some time to celebrate my dad and to share his story. And I'm just going to show you, there's his picture. And that's me sitting on his lap at age 2. Pretty special guy. Everything you just heard in Ruth's introduction, I couldn't have done without my dad. He was the inspiration and the motivation behind everything that I did. And I don't know how many of you here attended the event this weekend based on a true story. It was wonderful, and as a storyteller, I really appreciated it. I was truly amazed at some of the people like our Nin here who were able to share their stories without notes. That always amazes me. I can't remember my PIN numbers right now. And these people just get up there and recount long stories. So I'm going to read from some notes. I've been editing a lot of books. That's how I earn my living. And journalism really hasn't been my livelihood. It's been my profession, but I've had to make my livelihood and income from other ways. And I've been editing a lot of books, and in the last month, I think I've edited about 750,000 words. So I was just telling some of my friends here that my brain is alphabet soup, so I couldn't remember one sentence from the other. But I want to start out by saying that fatherhood is truly a noble calling. And so this is a day when we want to remember all dads for all their contributions to us and to the world. The great dads and the not so great dads. I've been telling my dad's story for many years, and I often have people approach me and say, Well, you were lucky to have such a great dad. My dad, not so great. So we're going to talk about that too, because they have all imparted some wisdom or some lesson in some way that may not be obvious to you on the surface. But when we take another look, they have gifted you with something tremendous in some great or small way. I was talking to my sisters just last night on the phone. We all loved our dad and really cherished him, and every year we kind of get together and have a conference call. We all live in different parts of the country, and we get together and chat and remember Dad. And my sisters were really thrilled that I was writing about him and talking about him. And one of my sisters said, "Gosh, I wish Dad was alive to see the story you wrote and the fact that you're talking about him." And I said, "Are you kidding? Dad would be mortified. He was such a humble guy. He'd be embarrassed, to have his picture in the paper." But we all know that humble people, that's the way they are. And a lot of the subjects of my Extraordinary People column share with me that they're really embarrassed to have their name put in lights. And I totally understand that, because that's how my dad would have been. They just do what they do. And that's what we find with dads. We just do what we do. And how many of us recall our father saying that? My dad was always saying, "You just do what you gotta do." And, part of his story, I know some of you have probably seen it in the paper, and I'll share a couple of excerpts for those of you who haven't. But his full story isn't in there. He lost his father when he was 12 years old during the Great Depression. His dad was hit by a trolley car on his way home from work. And there were 4.5 kids and, a mom at home. And my dad was the eldest boy. And he had to leave 6th grade and go out and figure out at 12 years old how to become a breadwinner and support 4 brothers and sisters and his pregnant mom. That just amazes me. I mean, when we look at the men of that era of the last century and the wars and the Depression and the responsibilities and the challenges that they had, I look at myself at 12, I can't imagine going to work to feed myself, let alone 4 brothers and sisters. But one of my dad's lessons was that it's in adversity that we find our greatest strength. And that was a lot of what gave him his spirit and kept him going. He shares stories with us about how 12 years old, where does a 12-year-old kid go for a job with enough money to feed a family? Well, little boys in those days became newsboys. So he was in New York City and went to Times Square and was a newsboy hawker with his little cap and his knickers. And they were only getting like a nickel a paper or 2 cents a paper, something really minuscule. And my dad's like, "I got to do better than this." So at 12 years old, he became very enterprising and realized that the Western Union Company used messenger boys. And he figured out in his little 12-year-old mind, if he could get the route delivering moneygrams to the Broadway showgirls, they would give him big tips. And that's exactly what he did and exactly what happened. So, by 13, he was making great money. And he just loved the stories of how, he'd go backstage, very exciting to go backstage Broadway, and all these gals with their feathers, these were the days of, what do they call them, the Follies? And they had all these costumes, and he was just dazzled by these beautiful women, and they would just smother him with kisses when they saw him coming, because they had sugar daddies, and he was bringing money. So they loved to see my dad show up, and he got all these giant tips. So his saying was always that here in the Great Depression, he was feeding his family roast beef at 13 years old. Pretty incredible. And his family was most all boys, and then his mom had a little girl, the youngest, after their father passed. So a few years later, all of these boys were suddenly going off to war. I often think about my grandmother. She was a really strong woman, and she sees her 5 boys going off to war, 4 boys. Bye, it's really something to think about what people went through in that era. And it's important to remember these stories because the courage and the strength that our fathers and our families have, and they often don't talk about, especially war. Men go off to war, they saw incredible things, and they performed courageous acts, and yet we just never talk about them. So in a moment I'm going to talk about why it's important to write the stories or to keep them alive just within our families or to share with others. I can't tell you, I've written this story about my dad in various shapes and forms over the years, and invariably somebody has come back to tell me that it made a difference in their lives. So, think about your father and what he taught you, or some wisdom or something he did that you want to share with your family and preserve that memory and that wisdom for others. One of my funny memories is when I was a teen, I didn't really get along with my dad that well. We were kind of funny in our teen years, and even though I really loved my dad and we had a great relationship, there was a little bit of distance. I'm coming of age and getting interested in boys and not really quite comfortable with my relationship with my dad. So I wanted to get out of the house and get out in the world. So I remember one Father's Day I said, "Well, Dad, I would have really liked to give you the present you would really want for Father's Day. I just don't have the money to move out yet and get my own apartment." And it's a funny perspective of fathers. My dad always had some kind of wisecrack or wise line or kind of funny saying, and I have to look at my notes. What he said in response to me is, I went to war and then I had you kids. Sometimes I think I'd rather go back to the war. And he really didn't mean that, but this was kind of our funny banter together. But one thing Dad taught us was to always keep a sense of humor. And humor is what gets us through, we all know, some of our toughest times in life. And he taught us to always expect a miracle and never ever give up. That was his famous refrain over and over. Expect a miracle and never, ever, ever give up. And that's how I've gotten through my life difficulties, just always remembering that line of his. And he also taught us to laugh fear in the face. Not an easy thing to do, easier said than done. But when we look at fear and we're able to laugh at it, it gives us a strength and it gives us a tremendous wellspring of courage. Heaven knows Dad had his share of it in the war. He was a pilot with the Army Air Corps. His plane was shot down at B-17. He pulled his flight crew to safety. And when I was younger, I used to say, "What was that like, Dad?" And, he just shrugged it off. Well, you just do what you had to do. He pulled the guys, and he got a Purple Heart, but it wasn't about the rewards, the awards and the medals. It was just, this is what we do. And I think this is the strength that we see and learn from our dads. He was at Pearl Harbor, and many people often say, "Oh, was his plane shot down in Pearl Harbor?" No. The funny story about my dad is that, Pearl Harbor happened on a Sunday morning, and he was all of like 19, 20 years old, and he said, "Well, the night before was Saturday night. What do guys do? We went out and partied. And we were all out drinking and womanizing and flirting with all the nurses at the Pearl Harbor base the night before." And what actually saved my dad is that early the next morning, one of his bunkmates said, "Hey, Joe, we were kind of bad guys last night. We better go to church and, straighten up." My dad didn't want to go, and he goes, yeah, you're right. So they left the base early and went down the island to a Sunday service. And it's while they were there that their whole base, they returned and it was gone. So my dad used to joke that going to church kind of saved his life. But he didn't go, he wasn't a regular churchgoer, just kind of a funny reference. But the funny thing is that I never fully grasped the impact my dad had on my life until I had to face my own mortality one day. And that came in the form of death threats during an investigative report I was conducting. Reporters don't talk about it a lot, but we get more threats than you would imagine. If you're pursuing the truth, not, weather reports and school board meetings. I'm talking, when you're addressing the issues. And so it was a defining moment, not just in my career, but in my life. That moment you get a death threat, it's intimidating, it's frightening, it's scary. But I knew I had to tap that Rourke reserve, I call it, that my dad taught me, because I had chosen this profession, I was in it, I was very close to breaking the story. Do you give up? Do you give in to fear? Or do you keep going? And this happened after my dad passed away, so I didn't have him to turn to. Of course, believe me, I got tough, pushed my dresser up against the door, called my boyfriend to come over and stay with me, because it's scary. But then I'm like, I am not going to let this get me down. This is what my dad taught me. Never let anything get you down. So it was in that moment that I really realized that I had inherited what my father taught me. And I did exactly what he would have wanted me to do. And I laughed at the nasty dude, laughed him in the face, and I actually delivered a reverse threat to him. And of course, believe me, I watched my back. I checked under my car to make sure there were no pipe bombs. And the death threats eventually evaporated, and my story did get out, and the truth did get out. But those death threats went on for 3 months, so it was a scary time when, I called on my dad from the other side to protect me and watch out over me. But my dad always taught us kids never to take crap from anyone, especially slimes like that. And it's real important to take a stand. So, this is my father's legacy, and it's one that I really treasure. Now, as you can imagine, as I was saying, you can't be an investigative reporter without expecting to encounter slime. And that's what we do. We're digging through the muck. I often think, I call myself a muckraker, but that's kind of become a dirty word. I think it should be called truth raking, because what muckrakers are really doing is exposing what's hidden beneath the surface. But that's a talk for another time. We're going to focus on fathers. But if you've seen any movies about journalism, like All the President's Men, Spotlight, Kill the Messenger, reporters get doors slammed in their face all the time, threats, and very uncomfortable circumstances. So while I received plenty of both, it was my father's legacy that got me through those times and got me to where I am today. So it was at that time I began to realize the importance of preserving the memory, the story, and the legacy of our fathers. Because in the course of our young lives, we just look at it as, oh, this happens, but they really do ingrain something in us, and it stays with us. So we want to preserve that memory. Now, as part of this, I mentioned earlier that people say, well, I didn't have such a great experience. But the magic happens is that, even if your dad was a deadbeat or he wasn't present or you never knew him, he passed away before you got to know him, when you connect the dots and you sit down and you write about it just for yourself, not for publication, maybe to share with your family in a memory book. When you write this down for you, something incredible happens. The perception shifts from a negative to a positive, and you're able to see something that your dad gave you, no matter how awful he might have been. And I know some pretty awful dads. I have helped people in my memoir as medicine classes reframe their stories. And what happens is a cathartic healing occurs when we look at our fathers or our families and the not so good events and the not so good parents, and we reframe it in a way that we can see the gift they left us at the door. Very, very important. So I urge you all to remember your fathers, for better or for worse, to celebrate their memories and find the gift that your father left you. What is it about our fathers that we want to remember? I think about my dad, and in the course of an afternoon, he could check my math homework, he could fix the leaky bathroom sink, he could exile the unwanted salesman at the door, get rid of him. It was just like I always looked up to my dad as, this extraordinary guy who just got things done. But he's a pretty ordinary guy. So, we need to look at our fathers and to celebrate their extraordinary qualities. They're more than just breadwinners and handymen with honey-do lists. When we reframe their lives into a story, even with all their faults, they become simply extraordinary, even the worst of them. And even my father was far from perfect. Dad could survive Pearl Harbor and his B-17 being shot down, but he couldn't untangle the Christmas tree lights. Oh, what a fuss every Christmas. And he and my mom got in some pretty ugly arguments around the holidays. And I think we can all remember family incidents around the holidays. But he wrestled with movie projector. Remember the old movie reels? Oh gosh, he couldn't get that thing to spin on the projector. And he fumbled with this stuff. And I remember thinking, he survived Pearl Harbor and he can't wind the movie on the projector. So, we need to look at our faults and that we're not all perfect. We're perfectly imperfect. But as I wrote in my story, that these shortcomings, which often drove our moms crazy, they return to us years later as precious family heirlooms. And I think back, my dad couldn't knot his tie right. He had this collection of Celtic plaid ties, and just could never quite get the knot right. What was that? Funny things, but we need to remember those things and pass them on to our kids and grandkids. So what was your dad like? Can you think of those kind of funny traits? And what things do you want to remember about him? Write them down, even if it's, my grandfather, and this was my paternal grandfather, he came over from Europe in 1910 at age 16 with a few bucks in his pocket, came processed through Ellis Island not speaking a word of English. I never got his story. What was his story? Imagine the courage, imagine the fear. What would he say about that? I remember he told me one story as a kid where he was waiting to be cleared from Ellis Island, and he was looking over the railing at Manhattan, which was like a fairyland in the distance. Must have looked like Disney World. And there was one guy who wasn't cleared by the authorities because he had some kind of physical problem, and the guy said, there's no way I'm going back. I'm not going back to the old world. So he just, and it was nighttime, he dived over the side and said he was swimming across New York Harbor. to get to Manhattan. And my grandfather always said, I always wondered if he made it and what became of his life. But these are the stories that all of our families have. And they just kind of get lost. They fall through the cracks, but they're so precious. So retrieve those stories. Celebrate your fathers and your grandfathers, and of course our mothers and grandmothers, but we're talking about fathers today. You know, men go through wars, the workplaces, what do they have to do to accomplish their incredible feats? So what I just want to say in closing, and I'm going to share an excerpt from my dad's story. For me, memoir and spirituality are intertwined, and they coexist as part of my path as a truth seeker. And, you know, it's not just about investigative reporting and exposing the villains out there. It's about the truth in our own lives and our fathers and our families. It's just important to me as my investigative reporting. Memoir becomes medicine when we find divinity in the shortcomings of perfectly imperfect family members. As I write the extraordinary people's stories in our local paper and teach memoir as medicine, I marvel at how every soul, no matter how humble, has some incredible nugget of wisdom to share that can inspire each of us on our paths and make a significant difference in our journeys and shift our perspectives. There's one guy I'm pursuing right now for my column, and he's being very elusive. He doesn't want to have his name in lights, and you're going to love Siuslaw. I'm going to get him. If I could get those investigative reports, I'm going to get this guy and tell his story. But he's so humble, he's so embarrassed. He reminds me of my dad. And he's like, I can't be up there. This is just what I do. This is just what I do. So 2 days ago, after the story came out on Wednesday, 2 days ago, I got an email from a total stranger, a tourist who had passed through Florence and picked up the paper. And in her email, she said that she lost her own dad about 2 months ago, and this story offered her so much relief for her grieving heart, still grieving. But it also inspired her to write a story about her dad. And when I read that, I'm like, that's what this is all about. It's about inspiring others to remember their fathers and to celebrate them and to do the same. So tell your father's story, keep your dad's memories alive, find the beauty and the lessons he taught you, and allow that wisdom to illuminate your life and serve as a beacon of hope for generations to come. My dad's been gone about 15 years, but his story continues to touch and to uplift so many lives. I'm sure your dads can do the same. So I'll just close with a little excerpt. How are we doing on time? We have about 5 minutes. I'm just going to share something that is for all of you dads here. When Dad was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, being the writer in the family, I had to write the eulogy. And believe me, it wasn't easy. It was probably the hardest writing I ever had to do in my life. So finally, this is what I came up with, and this is for all of you dads. You can take all your great heroes, your generals and your gurus, your statesmen and your saints, your popes and your prophets, and still all dim in comparison to the humble greatness of a loving father.